Right. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see you all. Thanks for joining Met How at Home's program today with Richard Hart. Such an honor to have you again, Richard, teaching us so much about what's happening in the land of legal disputes with our indigenous tribes working to fight for their rights. So I'm going to let you go ahead and finish introducing yourself, and without any further ado, thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. So I have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'll be brief in my introduction. I'm a historian, ethno-historian. I've worked on tribal as an expert witness. I'm not an attorney. I've worked as an expert witness uh, for about the past 50 years, since the 1960s. And this is the very first case that I worked on involved the Zunis, the Zuni Pueblo. So I'll back up a little bit and say the policy of the United States through the late 19th century and the early 20th century was of assimilation. The idea was that if white people could teach Indians to be Christians and to wear white clothes and live in white houses, that eventually they would assimilate with the rest of the population and we wouldn't need to worry about reservations and tribes anymore. That didn't work out too well. The tribes tended to stay as tribes and didn't assimilate, no matter what the kind of policy or strategies the government used to force them to assimilate. So in the early 20th century, many tribes, California tribes, and all over the United States, tribes sued the United States for lands taken without payment or without proper compensation. And at the same time, in the early 20th century, especially in the 30s and 40s, there was a movement to simply terminate tribes. The idea being that the assimilation had been unsuccessful, and so the special rights, the reservations, the special treaty rights, all these rights should be just terminated by the United States, and Indians should deal with that however they might deal with it. As a result, in the 1940s, these two sides agreed that there needed to be a lawsuit. Either way the policy went, there needed to be the potential for tribes to sue the United States. And so a guy who was really well known as an attorney, as an advocate for tribes, by the name of Felix Cohen, wrote an act called the Indian Claims Commission Act, and it was passed in 1946. And that act allowed every tribe in the United States to sue the United States. It was a jurisdictional act, so it allowed tribes to sue the United States for lands taken without proper compensation. So that was passed in 1946. It had a 5-year statute. Originally, it had a 5-year statute of limitations, so tribes had 5 years to file their claim. So I had been working in 1968. I had been working for the Zuni Pueblo for a while. I had written some curricular materials for them that they used in their schools. I think their idea was mainly to educate the teachers. And so they asked me down that year, and we had a big meeting with the council, and they said, we have 2 questions for you. One, none of the council spoke English. English was a second language for everybody on the reservation, and most people didn't have a second language. Most people just spoke Zuni at that time, which is a separate language group. So we had this meeting, and the council asked me, they said, we have 2 questions for you. One, did the Zuni tribe have a claim against the United States under the Indian Claims Commission? And if so, why didn't we file it before the statute of limitations ran? Okay. And they said, we'd like to hire you. They had just sold the right of way for a power transmission line from the Four Corners power plant. And so they had the first disposable income they'd ever had of any significant amount. It wasn't all that significant. I didn't make very much money. Uh, and so I agreed to do that for a year and eventually wrote a couple of reports, one big one that was submitted to Congress, and eventually in 1974, a big portion of that was published in the Congressional Record. And then finally in 1976, 8 years after I started on this project, Congress passed a jurisdictional act allowing the Zunis to sue for compensation for lands taken without payment or without proper payment. So I started working then on my expert testimony. Eventually, in the early 1980s, we went to court, and eventually in 1990, we settled the cases. In the meantime, I said cases, and that's because in the meantime, somewhere along the line, I realized that the Jurisdictional Act allowed for suing for damages to existing lands. And so we filed a second land claim against the United States for acts or omissions, that is, things they did or things that they should have done but didn't do. And this was for the damage to the trust lands, the reservation lands. And what had happened was the United States had established a military fort in the Zuni Mountains just above the reservation. And the military officers who ran that fort had first signed contracts to clear cut the whole mountainside, and they didn't leave any seed trees. Today, of course, even when there is a clear cutting, they do leave seed trees. And then after clear cutting the mountainside, they ran herds of cattle over it, and after that, herds of sheep. And as a result, there was an episode of erosion on the reservation. Every stream bed on the reservation was eroded down 30, 40 feet. It was a terrible episode, and it destroyed all of the agricultural land. They had 10,000 acres of corn in 1850. By 1906, they had 0 acres of corn. So we filed a second lawsuit, which was immediately opposed by the same people that became climate change deniers, who claimed this was, in fact, an act of God and just a normal climate change that would have happened no matter what the United States did or didn't do. And interestingly, I'll just get into that case a little bit first. Interestingly, what I did was I hired the two most prominent climatologists, dendroclimatologists, so that they study the climate change on the basis of tree rings. And these were people who had said there was a natural cycle of erosion which occurred in the Southwest as a result of climate change. And so I asked them to look at this, to not worry about the general conclusions, but to just look at this local area and determine if this was the result of natural climate change or the result of human activity. And it was a bit of a gamble, I must admit, but they did agree that it was not as a result of climate change, but as a result of the human activity in the clear cutting, overgrazing. There was a little bit of mining, but that didn't have a lot to do with it. So by 1990, we had tried the first case, and the court had determined that the tribe had lost some 12 million acres of land. The way these cases worked, they were bifurcated. So you had two parts. The first part was the determination of the amount of land that was taken, the boundaries of that land. And the second part was to determine the second portion of the case would determine the value of the land at the time it was taken. So if the land was taken in 1850, for instance, the value of semi-arid land in the Southwest might be 10 cents an acre. And that was what the United States paid. There was no interest. And the reason they argued that was that they said that tribes didn't have real title, they only had aboriginal title. And aboriginal title was like a use right. So it's good that the United States recognized aboriginal title, but it was too bad that it didn't recognize that that was the same as real title. So what we did is we actually appealed that decision in regard to the Zuni's case only, and said that Mexico and Spain had recognized the actual border line of the Zuni Pueblo, of its territory, and therefore it was a recognized title. And we provided evidence of Spain and Mexico showing the borders of Zuni territory. That Spain and Mexico both looked at the pueblos, especially the western pueblos, Zuni, Hopi, and Acoma and Laguna, looked at those pueblos as allies against the Navajos and the Apaches. They viewed the Navajos and the Apaches as enemies, and so they actually armed Zuni. They provided Zuni with guns and allowed Zuni to have horses. And Zuni had a mounted, armed militia of about 500 people, which was a larger militia than any of the Navajo bands could put together. Navajo didn't have a central organization. And so the organization of Zuni was extremely valuable to Spain. And that's one of the reasons why they recognized their boundaries. However, the federal court wouldn't agree with us. They didn't agree that Spain and Mexico's recognition of those boundaries constituted real title, in spite of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which should have guaranteed that. And so we had to settle on the idea of getting land, getting value at the value of the land at the time it was taken. Now, what the experts in previous cases, most of the tribes filed lawsuits between 1946 and 1951, most of the tribes in the United States. And what they usually did was determine an average time of taking. So they would say, well, the average lands were taken between 1846 and 1900, so we'll average it out and say they were taken in 1876. And so the value of lands in 1876 was 25 cents an acre, and that's what we'll get. What we did is I constructed a map showing the exact time when I thought each parcel of land was taken. And some of these we were able to show the United States had not shown any title to the land until the 1940s, until the 1930s. And so we had a map with that showed all the various different parcels at the various different times of taking, and we're able to get a much larger total that we thought was owed to the tribes. We estimated that if you accepted everything we said, the value of the land would have been $100 million or something. It's still nothing like, of course, what it would be valued in real terms if it was real title. The second case, in the meantime, we were attempting to value what agricultural land was worth on the trust lands, the lands in the reservation. And we ended up saying that if you really looked at the value of those lands, 10,000 acres, and the value of agricultural land, irrigated agricultural land because it was irrigated, that you were looking at many millions of dollars, and that the erosion, to repair the erosion, would cost actually hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, eventually the United States, the Department of Justice and the United States decided that they wanted what they called a global settlement. They wanted a settlement of both cases at the same time and get rid of the whole matter once and for all. And so we had a whole series of hearings in Congress, and Congress had to decide what they thought they were willing to pay the tribe in order to settle these cases. The Zuni, on the one hand, had to gamble that if it went to court, they might face a bad Supreme Court eventually and lose everything. They could not get anything. The United States worried that it would lose hundreds of millions of dollars. So somewhere in between was where Congress thought the answer should be, and eventually Congress determined that they would pay $50 million. Now, at the time, I mean, the Zuni was poor. The population was very poor. There was not high employment, at least of normal kind of jobs. So there was a big movement among people, among the general population, to receive what were called per capita payments. And I had done enough research among other tribes' decisions with the Indian Claims Commission to know that what usually happened when there were per capita payments was that money went out to everybody on the reservation, and they immediately went out and bought a new car. And the people that really benefited were the car dealers that operated off the reservation. So I was pretty much opposed to a per capita payment idea. And eventually the council agreed with me that they should, at least for half of for Zuni 2, as it came to be known, that was the eroded lands, the second case, that they would take half of the payment, 25 million, and allow us to set up a trust fund. I wrote legislation which called for the establishment of a $25 million trust fund, and the interest from that is to be used every year for repairing eroded lands and thus creating new agricultural lands. So we settled this in 1990 for $50 million, and half of the money went into this trust fund. I'm happy to report that today, it's 30 years later, there are 3,000 or 4,000 acres of agricultural land now in production at Zuni, and there'll be a couple of hundred more acres every year until they're back to where they were once. That is, if their water adjudication works out as I'd like to see it. So it was an amazing project. Zuni in 1968 was provincial and insular. As I mentioned, they spoke Zuni as their first language. Very few people spoke English. The tribal council, I had to have an interpreter because nobody on the council really spoke good English. The first step I had was to try and determine, it was easy to show that they did have a claim. What was more difficult was to show why they hadn't filed a claim by 1951. So going through the correspondence, I found finally a letter dated on the exact date that the statute was to run, 5 years in 1951, and signed by the tribal council saying they didn't have a claim against the government. Well, this was a little bit suspicious to me that this letter would get signed on the exact date that the statute ran. So I tracked down the person who had been the governor or tribal chairman of the tribe at that time and other members of the council. And they informed me that a representative of the BIA had told them that if they filed a claim, the United States would take their reservation away. Well, the Zunis, like a lot of other tribes, their reservation was the heart of their old ancestral lands. So when the movement for termination went on, one of the arguments that was made was that the Indians had been placed in concentration camps. This was after the end of World War II. And this was a persuasive argument which convinced many liberal Democrats to support termination. I remember talking to Frank Church, the Democratic senator from Idaho, who voted for termination because he thought reservations were were like concentration camps. The Indians, on the other hand, like Zuni, felt like this was the core of their ancestral lands. The last thing they wanted to lose was the very heart of their traditional lands. So they had a very different perspective about it. But as I said, they were provincial and insular, and they had kept a lot of information secret. I remember one of the first, when I started working on this, doing my research for this case, the very first time I was invited by a family to dinner, I remember it was a house with dirt floors. They didn't have wood floors, and nobody spoke English. So I was getting by as best I could, and they served dinner, and what it appeared to me, they called it mutton stew. They called it lamb stew, I think, but it was more like old mutton. And then there was bread from Horno's beehive ovens, and there were just small amounts. There was just a small loaf of bread, and there wasn't a lot of stew, but there was a fairly large bowl of what appeared to me to be string beans. And so I took a small amount of stew and a small amount of bread, and then I took a nice big helping of the string beans, which I quickly realized were actually jalapenos cut into strips. And I remember them looking at me as tears were running down my cheeks, saying, "Oh, you really like those?" And so I figured I better, since I had served myself all that, I better finish it. But the point being, this man came to be a kind of friend of mine, and he eventually described to me how an interloper, a white interloper who had stolen a homestead, a home of Zunis, and had taken their well, how the Zunis murdered him. And he described in some detail the manner in which the guy was killed. He also took me to a place where there was a very well documented gun battle between rustlers, white rustlers, and Zunis. And he was able to show me where bullets bounced off rocks and where bullets hit Zunis, and eventually where some troops came from the United States and arrested the rustlers after 3 or 4 Zunis were killed. And he could describe in great detail down to where bullets bounced off rocks and show me where the chips in the rocks still existed. So the value was that, to me, that they had maintained all these traditions and still could pass them on, and they had been secret for all these years. On the other hand, because they were provincial and insular, there was a big tendency to keep things secret and to not explain why things had happened as they had. So it was a difficult case, and I never did think that $50 million was enough for what had been taken from them. But from their point of view, it was the first real money they ever had, and they used it. They used half of it mainly to buy back land that they had lost, so that there weren't very many per capita payments. The per capita payments, I think, amounted to about 5 or 10 million out of the 50 million. So in the end, it was very productive, and today they're on their way to being much more, to having much more employment and a much better economy than they had in the past. So in determining the lands that were, the rule of the Indian Claims Commission was you had to show that lands were, that the tribe had exclusive use and occupancy. The rule, the idea was that tribes couldn't be sharing any land, and the outcome in the court was that if there were ever any joint use areas, the court would not pay anybody. So witnesses for the United States and witnesses for the tribes tended to agree. They were mostly anthropologists in the 40s and 50s and 60s, tended to agree on a line that sort of took joint use areas, drew a line down the middle of them so that the tribes would share payment for them and somebody would get paid for all of the land. Today, we at Colville and elsewhere, the tribes really object to that because they can show areas that were jointly used by several tribes, and they point out that the tribes got along very well. And with the Colville tribes, some of these joint use areas nobody did get paid for. So there were a lot of things that came out of the Indian Claims Commission which went against the tribes. On the other hand, one of the things, two important rights continue today as a result of determining Aboriginal title. One is tribes now have the right to claim under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. They have the right to claim to rebury the human remains of people that are found within their Aboriginal territory. And under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, tribes can claim objects of cultural patrimony, it's called. I've often said that maybe they should have considered objects of cultural matrimony, but it's a patrilineal government that we have. So, for instance, if a religious site is found, or if human remains are found where there are religious objects buried with the individual, then the tribe has a right to claim those objects as well as to rebury the human remains. Where Section 106 came to play with us in the valley, here in the Methow Valley, there were two cases recently. One was what they called the high altitude helicopter training site that they were going to establish up by Mazama. And the tribe pointed out that had been traditionally an area under Section 106, an area that was used for vision quests by the Methow people. And so they objected to the establishment of any kind of construction within that area. They used a similar argument opposed to the mining company, the Canadian Mining Company, which was planning on constructing the copper mine above Mazama. They said, that we had documented through interviews. In fact, I had done interviews with people 25 years, 30 years ago, who identified that area as a vision site area long before there was any word of any mine to be established up there. And the tribe threatened to sue if that mine was allowed to proceed. I always thought that action of the tribe was very helpful in stopping that mine. So today, there are a couple of other minor kinds of rights that tribes can initiate litigation in regard to as a result of the establishment of Aboriginal boundaries. It did because another thing that happened was when a tribe didn't file a land claim, or when it had a poor representation or simply wouldn't come up with evidence, and sometimes being insular and provincial would lead them to do that. In those cases, other tribes might take advantage of the situation and claim a larger area than they actually used. And that has led to difficulties today, intertribal disputes that probably wouldn't have existed traditionally. So as I was gathering evidence, one of the hardest things to determine was the extent of religious use. That was when we talk about a tribe being insular and provincial. One of the last things they want to expose or reveal to the non-Indian public is their religious activities, their religious sites. And you, even today, like at Colville, frequently over the years, mostly in previous years, I've been called out to look at potential burial sites. And I've had a couple of ranchers in this area who have said they've come across burials and wanted to determine if there really were tribal burials. And the tribe's response is to try and not call any attention to that. Their belief is that there will be more looting if sites are identified, and it's best to just simply leave them alone. So they will tend now to take a GPS reading where the location is. If it's around any habitation, they'll fence it, but otherwise they tend to just leave it alone and not try and call any attention to the burial sites. So religious use, burial sites, some of these things were really difficult to document. In the end, we were able to establish the religious use area. We had maps showing religious use, gathering, digging of plants and gathering, grazing. After the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, the tribes acquired a lot of sheep, and so they had large herds of sheep in the mid-19th century. The Zuni, like a lot of other Pueblos, didn't take to the horse. They viewed the horses competing with them for food sources. So they didn't really like to have a lot of horses around, except for warfare. And they did keep mounts for their militia. So we had maps showing agriculture, gathering, religious use, grazing, and when you superimposed all of these, there was an area that was about 12 million acres that was pretty difficult to dispute. I remember that the United States at one time tried to argue that part of this was Navajo territory, and they cited about 20 documents that in which somebody had identified Navajos as being in this area. So I went back and looked at every one of the documents, many of which were, of course, in Spanish, and was able to determine that in every single case, the Navajos were being chased out of the area, either by US troops or by Zuni militia. So that argument didn't work too well. I wanted to say a couple of more words about the Zuni Mountain. So what we had to do with that was we were able to show, the first argument was the United States argued that it was not responsible for the clear cutting of the mountains. And so I was able to find actually the records of the lumber company that did the cutting and show that the principal owners were the military leaders at Fort Wingate. And we had a section by section analysis of cutting. And they were doing it for profit reasons, to show their profit. But it worked very well for us because we were able to show the erosion tied with the cutting. The erosion increased as the cutting increased. And then when we had sheep and cattle going over it, we also showed the records of the military commanders who owned the sheep and owned the cattle. And as I said, we we did dendrochronological studies showing how much the climate changed, how much rainfall there was each year, and that the rainfall could not be shown to be responsible for the unusual cycle of erosion, because the same cycles of rainfall had occurred many, many times in the past without any erosion. We had a big series of depositions in Albuquerque one year, and in anticipation of that, I made up t-shirts that showed Harley motorcycles on the front, and on the back said cycles, Zuni cycles. And all of our witnesses wore these to the depositions. The Justice Department was scratching it. The attorneys were scratching their heads, wondering what this was all about. So in 1990, we finally settled these cases for $50 million. As I said, I didn't think it was enough, but that was as much as Congress was willing to pay. So I was hoping there would be a few questions or comments.
I have an odd question. This is Sheila.
Okay, Sheila.
Did the Zuni give you a name in their language?
Yes, they had a couple of names for me. Initially, they called me, they had a Zuni name for a fast rabbit. And then later on, they named me for a slow tortoise as I grew older.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, but my son, one of my son's names was Onothlikitsana, which is a certain kind of a species of bird, a little species of bird, but now they call him Tlana, which is a big species of bird. So yeah, it's they named almost everybody all the time traditionally.
Yeah.
Some of the anthropologists we learned had not gotten the correct interpretation for their names.
Yeah.
I won't repeat.
They probably earned it too.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Oh.
When was that clear cutting? I missed that date.
The clear cutting
By the military?
began in the 1890s, and the sheep and the cattle carried on through the early 20th century, about 1910. The United States believed Zuni had a system of irrigation called floodwater irrigation. So
Yes.
they pray almost every day for rain. And I mentioned birds and bird feathers. The traditional leaders all know all the species of birds that ever show up at any point in the year. And whenever they pray, they plant what they call pieces of wood about as long as from their fingertip to their elbow, and they're painted, and on the end of them they have tied feathers from various birds, and depending on what the prayer is for will depend on what feathers there are. They identify primary flight feathers and down and secondary flight feathers. As I said, I think we had an ethno-ornithologist who identified 80 different species of birds that they used for prayer feathers, for prayer sticks.
Wow.
So they, another thing that we did was we used an expert who was expert in photogrammetry. So we had, because of Zuni being very picturesque, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a lot of photography done, and we had thousands of photographs at our disposal. And many of them showed the stream channels in their native state in the 19th century, and as they eroded and as they became fully eroded. As I said, the United States didn't believe that traditional Zuni irrigation was a civilized method of growing plants. And so they tried to get the Indians to stop doing that. At Zuni, if it rained, as I said, everybody prayed for rain almost every day. So if it rained, everybody went outside in the rain. After I moved to Seattle a long time later, I decided I wasn't going to stay inside when it rained, and I wasn't going to feel bad if it was raining. Having known people for decades who always went outside and smiled whenever it rained. So the way they approached irrigation was, if it was raining, they went out and moved the water as it rained, and they moved the floodwaters. Wherever there was a stream bed, an arroyo, they would build little check dams and move the water into the cornfields and into the rows of other specialty plants that they were growing. The United States decided that not only was this a bad form, but that the way that should be done is through canals and dams. And so there were only two real tributaries on the reservation, the Zuni River and the Nutria River, which is misnamed. It was Beaver, it wasn't Nutria. And so they built a dam called Black Rock Dam, and they built it in the years 2000 to 2006. And what happened was it immediately silted in to 90% of the capacity of water, and then it breached, which caused even more erosion. So there was a lot, it was more complicated than my overview showed you, but the United States over and over again took made the wrong decisions. And part of it is from never respecting the Zuni manner of managing its resources. Just one more example of how Zuni managed its resources. Zuni's traditional system of operation was the men controlled the priesthoods and what we call the executive arm of the government, the police or the military, the militia. Women controlled all property rights through the clans. So the matriarchs had complete control over use rights for agricultural fields and for grazing fields, and for even gathering areas. The United States officials early in the 20th century thought this was really terrible, that women would be given so much power. And so they arbitrarily identified a bunch of, I think it was 18 or 20 old men, and appointed them as the guardians or quasi-owners of grazing areas and agricultural areas. And to this day, there's still conflicts between the clans and the BIA people about who owns various fields. Although I think the clans have won most of those battles at this point. So
Jim had his hand up earlier, so I just want to be sure he has a chance to ask.
I was curious, Richard, 12 million acres is a huge amount of land. It's like 20,000 sections. I'm curious as to what was the approximate boundaries of that area. I'm a little bit familiar with that part of the state, and so I'm just curious as to how much, what kind of was kind of the limits of their movements.
okay, so in the south, they went down to, where Springerville, St. John's are.
Mm-hmm.
They went down, they included that area. They included a lot of the Little Colorado drainage, the upper Little Colorado drainage. We had a number of lawsuits. The claims cases split into several other pieces of litigation. So there was a water case involving the Little Colorado, and there were religious use rights also for part of that area. One of the things the Zunis had to do at the initial, when we filed the original lawsuits, we told them the United States is going to treat this like a quiet title case. So if there are places where you believe that you could never ever sell the area or never receive compensation for it, any religious site that you think is that important, you should exclude it. And so they excluded two areas. One was Kotlawalawa, which is the area where they believe they go after death. And the other was Zuni Salt Lake, which is about 30, 40 miles directly south of Zuni. So the Zuni, I forget the name of the mountains that kind of flow along the border of the Mexican border. Zuni's territory went down to those mountains. There's a big, huge plain to the south of Zuni. And in the middle of that is Zuni Salt Lake, which is a volcanic mar. Their lands to the east went as far as the Malpai. I don't know if you remember Malpai National Monument.
Mhm.
And El Morro, it went over that far. El
Yeah.
Morro was a spring that they controlled. If you were coming from Santa Fe or Albuquerque, I think it was the last water source before Zuni. To the north, it went
Thank you.
almost up to Mount Taylor. To the west, and so their lands abutted with Hopi and with Laguna, and to the south with Apache, with the White Mountain Apache. So the Spaniards viewed the Pueblo corridor as, if you can imagine, at the time, the Navajo were above the Pueblo corridor and the Apaches were below the Pueblo corridor, which is one of the reasons why the Spanish and then Mexicans armed the Pueblos, because they were important allies. I could pull out a map. I'm sorry I don't have a map ready to show you the extent.
No, that's
Maybe-
fine.
Does
That's
that give you
very helpful. Yeah, that's very helpful. It's quite large.
So what we did was we actually did a township by township analysis, which amounted to section by section, to show when title was first transferred to anybody for any purpose. And the United States was unable to show that it controlled. If you can hold, I'm going to grab a map that I can at least hold up in front of you. Hold on just 1 second.
Why did my picture just go off? I've got a problem here. I don't know what this means. I've been muting and unmuting. This happened. Can you get that
Okay.
picture?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
This is a map of the Zuni claim area. The gray part is the Zuni reservation as it exists today. And the different colors represent different times of taking.
let's see.
Wow.
So there